They said she was too emotional. They said she overreacted. They said she read too much into things. And eventually, they said she was the problem. But no one ever stopped to ask the real question. Who pushed her to the edge in the first place? Who created the silence that made her question her own heartbeat? Who shaped the confusion she carried like a shadow she couldn't step out of? Because breakdowns don't start with screaming. They start long before that, in the quiet moments that no one pays attention to. In this episode, we're going to understand exactly how a narcissist engineers emotional collapse. Slowly, quietly, deliberately, piece by piece. Not with loud fights, but with subtle behaviors that reshape someone's mind from the inside. And as we follow her story, her confusion, her doubt, her slow emotional erosion, we'll break down the psychology behind each moment. Stay with me. She didn't notice the beginning. Not because she wasn't aware, not because she didn't care, but because the beginning was designed to be unnoticeable. It didn't come with yelling or confrontation. It came wrapped in calmness, in small shifts in tone. In the slightest delay in a text message, in the soft drop of enthusiasm when she spoke. If someone had asked her then whether something felt wrong, she would have said no. Because the truth is, the early stages of manipulation feel like nothing at all. Just a slight drop in warmth, so small you'd blame yourself for even noticing. The first shift happened on a day that looked perfectly normal. She was sharing something small, ordinary, human, something she felt. She expected the same softness he once gave so freely, the warmth she had grown used to. But instead he replied with a vague, barely lifting his eyes. Not rude, not overtly dismissive, just empty. And emptiness, when you're not expecting it, hits harder than anger. She paused, waiting, hoping, giving him space to follow up. But he didn't. Most people dismiss moments like this. She did too. She told herself he was tired, stressed, in a mood. But this is where psychological conditioning begins. That small moment is the first chip at your emotional stability. When someone who once made you feel seen suddenly turns cold without explanation, your mind doesn't protect you. It turns against you. You don't question them. You question yourself. This is the first step of emotional erosion. The victim thinks, maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I asked at the wrong time. Maybe I'm too sensitive. The narcissist doesn't say these things. They don't need to. Your mind says it for them. Over the next few days, the pattern deepened, but never enough to alarm her. His texts became shorter. His responses lost warmth. Sometimes he sounded annoyed even when she wasn't asking for anything. It wasn't constant, just inconsistent. And inconsistency is the most destabilizing form of control. When behavior shifts without pattern or reason, the nervous system becomes hypervigilant, scanning for danger in every tone, every word, every silence. She found herself trying harder, softening her voice, explaining her feelings more gently, stepping around topics she didn't want him to misinterpret. She didn't realize that trying harder was part of the conditioning. The more you bend, the more they push. The more patient you are, the more they withdraw. She wasn't losing herself because she was weak. She was losing herself because she was adapting to survive connection the only way she knew how. One night, she tried to talk about something important to her. She was careful with her words, gentle in her tone. But as she spoke, he sighed and looked at his phone. She felt the shift instantly, that sinking in the chest, that tightening in the throat. And when he finally spoke, he said, "You're overthinking." Such a small sentence. 6 words. But those words carried the weight of a weapon. Dismissing someone's perception is one of the earliest forms of gaslighting. Gaslighting doesn't begin with, "that never happened." It begins with, "you're imagining things, you're too sensitive, you're emotional." She lay awake that night, replaying the moment over and over. Her mind ran like a broken film. Did I sound dramatic? Did I expect too much? Was I wrong to bring it up? When a narcissist dismisses your reality, your nervous system goes into self-correction mode. You stop trusting your reactions and start monitoring your emotions like they're potential threats. That's how self-doubt grows, not because something big happened, but because 1,000 small moments carved you down. The next day, she tried again to connect. A different topic, a lighter tone. She thought maybe he hadn't understood her the night before, but this time he walked away while she was speaking. No irritation, no anger, just absence. The kind of absence that communicates more than any words could. She froze for a moment, then followed him gently, asking, "Are you upset with me?" And he shrugged. "No, you're just too sensitive." This is a psychological attack disguised as feedback. When someone tells you your emotional reactions are inherently flawed, your internal compass begins to malfunction. You stop trusting your instincts. You start doubting your feelings. And once you stop trusting your own internal signals, you become dependent on their interpretation of reality. The withdrawal continued slowly. Some days he was warm, kind, close, attentive, and those moments felt like a relief, like he still cared, like everything was normal again. But other days he was cold, distant, almost irritated by her existence. This kind of pendulum swing creates trauma bonding, a cycle where the brain becomes addicted to unpredictable affection. You cling to the warmth because you've been starved of it, and you forgive the coldness because you're afraid of losing the warmth again. She didn't realize she was entering a psychological maze. She only knew something felt off, like the ground wasn't stable beneath her feet, like she had to measure every word before speaking to avoid triggering that coldness. Emotional walking on eggshells is the earliest stage of collapse. When your nervous system stays in a low-level state of alert around someone you care about, the body begins to deteriorate emotionally. Then came the moment that sealed the pattern. One evening she said, calmly and gently, "I feel like you've been distant lately." She wasn't blaming, she wasn't accusing. She was expressing a wound. And he laughed. Not a joyful laugh. A sharp, dismissive exhale. Then he said, "You're imagining things. Stop being dramatic." That moment engraved itself into her chest, not because of the words, but because of the meaning behind them. That her emotional reality wasn't real. That her perception couldn't be trusted. That her feelings were faulty. This is where gaslighting takes root, not when the narcissist denies events, but when they deny your interpretation of them. She lay awake again, spiraling, running scenarios, overanalyzing every detail, blaming herself for feeling hurt. And this is the exact point where emotional collapse begins. Not when someone shouts at you, but when someone quietly convinces you that your inner world is defective. By the end of episode 1, she is not broken yet, but she's cracked. Her emotional foundation is unstable. Her self-trust is fading. Her nervous system is locked in hypervigilance. She's walking toward the edge of a breakdown she doesn't know is coming, because narcissistic destruction doesn't begin with chaos. It begins with confusion. This is the beginning of her unraveling. The quiet descent, the setup, and what happens in episode 2 is the moment the ground finally gives way. She didn't recognize herself anymore, but the change had happened so slowly that she couldn't say when it began. She just knew that she cried more often now. Not always loudly, not always visibly. Sometimes it was just a tightness in her chest as she stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering why her life felt like a test she kept failing. Her world had become a place where she constantly questioned if she was too much, too needy, too emotional, too demanding. It never crossed her mind that maybe she was simply being pushed too far. The shifts that started quietly in episode 1 had multiplied. His coldness wasn't occasional anymore. It was routine. Some days he barely acknowledged her presence. Other days he responded with sarcastic comments or irritated sighs. The kindness he once showed up with now appeared more like a tool than a trait. Something he used, not something he was. He would sprinkle it in just enough to keep her from giving up completely. Psychologically, this is the reinforcement cycle. The brain latches onto rare rewards, even if those rewards are surrounded by emotional pain. When someone who hurts you occasionally treats you well, the nervous system becomes hooked on the hope that the good version of them will stay. That hope keeps you in place, even when your body is screaming that something is wrong. One evening she was cooking. It was quiet in the kitchen, except for the soft hiss of oil and the clink of plates. She had planned the meal carefully because she wanted it to feel like a normal night. No tension, no distance, just something small and safe. She set the table, lit a candle, not for romance, but for calm, and waited. When he walked in, she smiled softly and said, "I made your favorite." He didn't respond. He walked past the table, glanced briefly and said, "I'm not really hungry," as he picked up his phone and sank into the couch. Her smile faded, but she swallowed the sting and followed him into the living room. She sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands in her lap, trying to sound gentle instead of hurt. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You've just felt really far away lately." He didn't look at her. "I'm fine," he said. "You always make a big deal out of nothing." That sentence hit like a blow, not just because of what it said, but because of what it implied, that her emotional reality was an inconvenience. She tried one more time. "It doesn't feel like nothing to me," she whispered. He exhaled sharply, finally turning to her. "You're exhausting. You know that?" Her heart dropped. Exhausting. Not, "I'm stressed." Not, "I'm struggling." Not, "This is just a hard time." Instead, the problem was her. This is how psychological blame shifting works. The narcissist reframes the entire dynamic as a reaction to your supposed flaws. You're too sensitive, you're too dramatic, you're too demanding, you're exhausting. And when you hear it enough, You start believing it. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just went silent. The food went cold. The candle burned down. Something inside her tightened, like a knot pulled too hard. That knot was made of swallowed words, suppressed reactions, and 100 moments where she let herself be minimized for the sake of peace. Over the next few days, the tension grew thicker. She tried to be even quieter, even calmer, even more careful. She said sorry more than any other word. She checked her tone before she spoke. She edited herself in real time. But no matter how small she made herself, his irritation didn't fade. If anything, it increased. This is the cruel paradox of narcissistic dynamics. The more you shrink to avoid conflict, the more they despise you for shrinking. They won't say it out loud, but your self-erasure becomes more proof to them that they are above you, more powerful, more right. And so the pressure builds. One night, the breaking point came disguised as something ordinary. She was sitting at the table, scrolling absently through her phone, trying to distract herself from the feeling of being unwanted. He walked in, tossed his keys on the counter, and opened a conversation as if nothing was wrong. Talked about his day, about people he met, about things he did. She listened, nodded, tried to match his energy. She felt a flicker of relief. Maybe tonight would be okay. Then, casually, he mentioned spending time with someone who had once made her uncomfortable, someone she had gently expressed concern about before, someone he knew she felt uneasy about. She felt her chest tighten. "You went out with them?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, not accusing, just seeking clarity. He rolled his eyes. "Oh my God, here we go again," he muttered. Her pulse quickened. "I'm not trying to start a fight," she said. "I just thought you understood how that made me feel." He smirked, a small, cruel curve of the mouth that he probably thought she wouldn't notice. "You're paranoid," he said. "Seriously, you need help." In that moment, something snapped inside her. Not randomly, not out of nowhere. This wasn't an overreaction. It was an accumulation. Weeks of dismissal, months of subtle rejection, days of coldness stacked on top of old wounds. Her nervous system had been stretched past its limits, and this comment, this minimizing, mocking, pathologizing comment, was the final weight that made the structure collapse. Her voice rose. "I need help," she repeated, incredulous. "You ignore me for days. You act like I'm a problem just for having feelings. And now you're telling me I'm crazy because I'm hurt?" He leaned back, crossing his arms, expression now fully detached. "There it is," he said. "The drama. You always ruin everything." She stood up. She didn't mean to raise her volume, but it came out louder now, strained with the force of everything she had swallowed. "I have tried so hard to talk to you calmly," she said. "I've tried to be understanding. I've tried to be patient. But you act like I don't exist unless you want something. You make me feel like I'm insane for needing basic respect." He shrugged. "You're yelling," he said flatly. "This is exactly what I mean. You're unstable. This is the critical psychological moment. The narcissist provokes an emotional reaction. then uses that reaction as evidence of your instability. This is what many survivors later discover as reactive abuse. You are pushed, prodded, invalidated, and gaslit for so long that when you finally react, your reaction is taken out of context and turned into the whole story. She felt the heat rising in her body, her hands shaking, her throat tight, tears stinging at the back of her eyes. She didn't want to scream. She didn't want to be this version of herself. But she had been emotionally starved, dismissed, and minimized for so long that any attempt at calm communication was met with mockery or coldness. Her reaction wasn't random, it was designed. "I'm unstable," she yelled, the word tasting bitter as it left her mouth. "You ignore me, dismiss me, twist everything I say, and then when I finally get upset, you call me crazy. Do you have any idea what that's doing to me?" He shook his head slowly, almost amused. "You hear yourself?" he said. "Look at you right now. You're completely out of control." The irony was brutal. He had watched her unravel in real time, not with concern, but with calculation. Every time he gaslit her, every time he minimized her pain, every time he walked away in the middle of a vulnerable conversation, he was turning the dial on the pressure inside her. And now, as the pressure finally exploded, he stepped into the role he had been preparing for, the calm, rational, victimized one. The one who shakes his head and says, "See, this is why nothing I do is ever enough. This is why I pull away." She started crying then. Not the soft, silent kind, but the raw, desperate kind that comes from deep inside the chest. She paced, gestured, tried to find words to explain everything she had been carrying. But when someone has already decided that your emotions are invalid, any attempt to explain yourself looks like proof. The louder you get, the calmer they become. That contrast is not accidental. It is staged. Psychologically, this is a form of role reversal. The abuser becomes the victim, and the victim becomes the abuser in the narrative that gets written afterward. Narcissists are masters at this reversal. They push you into an emotional corner, then stand back and record your breakdown, if not on camera, then in their mind, ready to retell it to others later. She screamed at me. She went crazy. She overreacted over nothing. The story they keep is edited, stripped of context, and weaponized. After a few more minutes of shouting, she suddenly went quiet. Not because she felt heard, but because she realized she never would be. Her words were bouncing off a wall that had never been designed to let anything in. He looked at her and said with fake concern, "You really should talk to someone. This isn't normal." That sentence cut deeper than any insult. It suggested that the problem was not the dynamics, not the manipulation, not the emotional abandonment, but her mind, her sanity. Later, when she replayed that night in her head, she saw herself through his lens at first. Too loud, too emotional, out of control. Shame washed over her. She felt disgusted with herself. She wondered how she had become that person. The one who yells, the one who breaks, the one... She didn't wake up one morning suddenly healed or enlightened. There was no dramatic revelation, no lightning bolt of clarity. It started the way most awakenings do, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as a small shift in how she listened to herself. After the night she broke down, after the yelling and the tears and his calm, accusing stare, she went numb. For a while, that numbness felt like relief. No more analyzing every interaction, no more begging him to hear her. Just silence, inside and outside. But numbness has an expiration date. Sooner or later, something underneath it begins to move. Days passed in a blur. She went through the motions, work, messages, basic conversations. On the surface, things appeared to settle. He acted as if nothing serious had happened. Occasionally he would bring up that night, but only to remind her of how out of control she'd been, how she had overreacted, how she had made things uncomfortable for him. Every time he did, she shrank a little further into herself, swallowing guilt that never really belonged to her. Yet beneath the shame, another feeling quietly grew. A subtle resistance. A tiny internal voice that whispered, "Something isn't right." That voice didn't sound heroic. It didn't sound strong. It sounded tired. It sounded like someone who had been ignored for too long, finally muttering, "Enough." The strange thing was, nothing external had changed. He was still him. The same patterns, the same coldness, the same dismissive tone. The difference now was not what he did, but how she began to see it. One evening, she caught herself apologizing for something that didn't feel wrong. She heard the words leaving her mouth. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." And for a moment, it was like she stepped outside her own body and watched the scene from a distance. She saw herself standing there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes searching his face for cues, voice soft and careful. He barely looked up, muttered, "Yeah, you really need to watch how you talk," and returned to whatever he was doing. And in that split second, instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" her mind asked a different question. Why is this always my fault? That question lingered in the air. It followed her into the bathroom as she washed her face, into the bedroom as she changed her clothes, into the quiet moments where she usually tried to distract herself. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Why is it always me? Why am I always the problem? That question is the beginning of awakening. When your brain stops playing only their script and starts writing its own. Psychologically, this is the point where cognitive dissonance starts to crack. For so long, she had held two conflicting beliefs at once. He cares about me, and I'm constantly in pain around him. To resolve that conflict, she had chosen the explanation that hurt her the most. There must be something wrong with me. But when the pain becomes unbearable, the mind begins to look for new explanations. Not because you suddenly become brave, but because the old explanation can no longer hold the weight of your experience. Over the next days, she began to notice things she had previously explained away. The subtle smirk when she was upset. The way he would bring up her worst moments as weapons in new arguments. The way he added details to stories that made him look like the victim and her look unreasonable. The way he never apologized unless it served him. None of this was new. What was new was her attention. This time, instead of reflexively blaming herself, she allowed herself to silently ask, "What if this isn't all on me? She remembered specific scenes more clearly. The night she tried to talk about her feelings and he told her she was too sensitive. The time he ignored her messages all day and then told her she was clingy for being hurt. The argument where she finally screamed and all he took from it was, "You're crazy." She had replayed those moments before, but always with one question at the center. What could I have done differently? Now, for the first time, another question slid into place beside it. What did he do? That small shift changes everything. In abusive dynamics, the mind of the victim is trained to zoom in on their own behavior and zoom out on the abusers. You analyze every word you said, every look, every tone, but you give them endless context and benefit of the doubt. Awakening starts when you reverse that lens, even a little, when you stop dissecting yourself and start observing them. One afternoon, she was scrolling absent-mindedly on her phone, trying not to think at all. But the mind has a way of looping back to unfinished business. Without meaning to, she found herself replaying the night of her breakdown again. Only this time she ran the tape from earlier in the day, not just the explosive ending. She remembered how he had ignored her all morning, how he dismissed her concern in the afternoon, how he told her she was paranoid and needed help when she tried to express hurt, how he rolled his eyes, smirked, called her dramatic. She realized slowly that it hadn't been a random explosion emerging from nowhere. It had been pressure, layer after layer of psychological pressure. And that realization hit her with a quiet, devastating clarity. He wanted me to look like that. Maybe not consciously, maybe not like a villain in a movie stroking his own ego, but somewhere inside, he benefited from her breaking. Her explosion allowed him to claim the moral high ground. It gave him a story he could tell to himself, to others, where he was calm and she was unhinged. Seeing that pattern didn't immediately free her, but it did something crucial. It shifted the blame, even slightly, back onto him. She sat with that thought for a long time. Her chest hurt. Not in the frantic way it had during arguments, but in a deep, aching way. Like her heart was finally catching up with what her mind was realizing. If he pushed me there, then I wasn't just crazy. I was reacting. That was a painful truth, but it was also a comforting one. Painful because it meant she had tolerated something deeply toxic. Comforting because it meant she wasn't inherently broken. From a psychological perspective, this is the beginning of reclaiming narrative. Abusers rely on controlling the story about what happened, who caused what, who is to blame. Awakening begins when a survivor starts to rewrite that story, not by inventing anything new, but by finally telling the full version of events, putting back the parts that were edited out, restoring context to reactions that were shamed. She didn't confront him with her realizations. Not yet. That wasn't where her power was supposed to go. Instead, she quietly started to observe more. The next time he minimized her feelings, she noticed how quickly he changed the subject when she tried to ask for clarity. The next time he joked about her overreacting, she noticed the glint of satisfaction in his expression, like her confusion reassured him of his control. The next time he made a subtle jab, "You're lucky I put up with you," she noticed how natural, how practiced it sounded, as if he'd said it 100 times in his head. She didn't argue as much, not because she agreed, but because something in her was withdrawing. Not her love, not yet, but her belief that his version of reality was the only one. One night, she sat alone in the dark with only the soft light of her phone. She opened the Notes app and began to type, not for him, not to send, but for herself. She wrote down specific things he had said, specific patterns she had seen, specific ways she felt around him. She didn't embellish, didn't analyze, just recorded. Harsh comments, dismissals, silent treatments, blame, gaslighting. She wrote until there was a list, a quiet, undeniable record. Looking at that list, for the first time, she allowed herself to react to the pattern rather than each isolated moment. Seen one by one, the incidents had always felt too small to be taken seriously. But together, they painted something undeniable, a system, a design. Her mind whispered what she had been too afraid to say. This is abuse. The word felt too heavy, too serious, too big. It made her flinch. She wanted to delete it. She didn't feel like a victim of abuse. That phrase conjured images of bruises and broken bones and shouting matches. Her pain had been quieter, more private. But psychological abuse is exactly that. Quiet, private, often invisible. The lack of bruises doesn't mean there was no damage. The wounds are just in places no one can see. That night, she didn't tell anyone. She didn't make big decisions or announce anything to him. But inside, a line was drawn. Not a loud, sharp boundary, but a mental one. This is not okay. This is not all my fault. This is hurting me. And once that line exists, even faintly, the dynamic begins to lose some of its power. When you stop volunteering for the blame, the system that runs on your guilt starts to malfunction. Over the next days, something subtle shifted in her responses. When he tried to bait her into arguing, she felt the familiar surge of emotion rise inside her. But now she also heard a second voice say, "He wants you to react. He wants this to become about your reaction again." Instead of taking the bait, sometimes she stayed quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of awareness. She started recognizing provocations for what they were, invitations to reenact the same script where he plays the calm victim and she becomes the emotional problem. This internal awareness didn't make everything easier. In some ways, it made things heavier. Because once you see manipulation for what it is, staying becomes more painful. You can no longer fully convince yourself that it's not that bad, or everyone fights, or I just need to be better. The illusions that used to protect you begin to fall away, and what's left is stark. A relationship that feeds on your self-doubt. She had moments of backlash against herself. Moments where she questioned her own awakening and wondered if she was now the one rewriting reality to feel better. But each time she returned to the same anchoring question. Am I thriving here, or am I constantly recovering? The answer had become impossible to ignore. She was always recovering. Recovering from comments, from from coldness, from distortions, from his version of her. One day, he brought up her breakdown again, in that offhand, casually cruel way he had. "Just don't go psycho like last time," he said with a small smile, as if they were reminiscing about something mildly embarrassing instead of deeply traumatic. This time, she didn't internalize the words the same way. Instead of thinking, "He's right, that was insane," she thought, "You pushed me to that edge and you know it." She didn't say it out loud. The words stayed inside her, but they were louder now, stronger, more solid. Awakening doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like being fully aware of what happened while outwardly changing nothing, at least for a while. Because safety, timing, logistics, finances, and fear are all real factors. The mind can wake up before the life catches up. But that inner shift is everything. It is the beginning of disconnecting your self-worth from their narrative. It is the beginning of being able to say, "What happened to me was wrong," without immediately following it with, "And it's all my fault." By the end of this awakening, she is still there, physically. She hasn't left yet. She still hears his comments. She still feels the tension. She still has nights where she questions herself. Healing isn't linear, and awareness doesn't erase conditioning overnight. But something crucial has changed. She no longer believes the story that she is inherently broken, unstable, or too much. She sees that her reactions were human responses to inhumane treatment, and that shift, quiet, internal, unseen, is where her power begins. Because once you understand the design behind your breakdown, you stop trying to fix yourself to fit it. You stop asking, "How can I be less me so this hurts less?" And start asking, "Why am I in a place where being myself is treated like a problem?" That question doesn't give you all the answers, but it points you toward a door. In another episode, in another chapter of her life, she will walk through it. She will learn how to set boundaries, how to detach, how to leave, how to rebuild, how to soothe her nervous system, how to trust herself again. But for now, in this moment, episode 3 ends not with leaving, but with seeing. She sees him more clearly. She sees the pattern more clearly. Most importantly, she sees herself more clearly. Not as the villain of the story, not as the unstable one, not as the one who needs help because she felt too much. She sees herself as someone who was pushed slowly and strategically toward a collapse that was never accidental. And once you can name that, once you can hold that truth gently and bravely inside you, you are no longer just a character in someone else's script. You are the narrator of your own. And that is where real healing starts.